To get to grips with arguments about Darwin's delay, we need to know something of the tenor of the time in which Darwin was thinking about and then writing his great work. And the most important thing to understand was just how turbulent the 1830s and the 1840s were socially. When we get an idea of this, it begins to help us understand why certain historians have argued that Darwin was concerned about the social or moral impact of his theory. (1838), and it's 1 year after Darwin has opened his transmutation notebooks. Another CD, Charles Dickens, writing under the name of Boz, is following up his sensational success Pickwick Papers with an altogether more sombre book. This is Oliver Twist, the tale of the orphan who is made bad by circumstances and is then redeemed. It is a savage indictment of a society that lets the weak go to the wall while the bourgeoisie gets fat. Written at a time when issues of political representation and appalling working conditions are on everybody's minds, when Britain quite often appeared to teeter on the brink of revolution. The themes of the book formed a backdrop to some of Darwin's thinking, particularly the nature of the struggle for existence. If I were to select a decade in the history of Britain that was regarded as the most important of all, I would probably choose the 1830s because there was so much going on then. Not only Darwin developing his theories, but in the realms of politics, economy and society, we're on the verge of absolutely massive change. Political power is still very much held in the hands of the aristocrats, the gentry, the wealthy, the people that could get their hands on power. Now, democracy was not fully fledged at this time. However, in the early 1830s and indeed in 1832, the Great Reform Act occurred, widening political representation, increasing hugely the numbers of people that could vote. Further reform over the next 100 years before suffrage was granted to everybody of adult age. At the same time, we see the rapid progress of industry, the development of the new factory system, which was accompanied by a huge influx of people from villages to the towns. The nature of the economy is such that it is running through cycles at an incredible pace, boom going to bust, going to boom, going to bust. And on the back of that, we see incredible poverty. The new cities just cannot cope. They don't have the infrastructure to deal with the vast numbers of people flocking to them. The people flocking to them are not earning enough money to get themselves a decent living. We see a huge rise in poverty, the emergence, the classic urban slum. Poverty that is documented by Engels when he travels around Britain in the early 1840s and produces his report on the state of the English working classes. The response to the massive social dislocation caused by industrialisation by the people in authority can best be characterised as cruel. And this was the thing that Dickens himself was aiming at. Influenced by Malthusian thinking, a new system of workhouses were constructed, virtual prisons for the people who are unable to work or who wouldn't. The workhouses were inspired by the idea that if you made conditions so horrible within them, people would not apply for help. Instead, they'd use their own initiative and go out in the world and find a job. Of course, in times of economic hardship, this was just impossible. Now, the response to these political, social, economic changes, to the deficit in political power, the response to poverty, was the Chartist movement, which from the 1830s campaigned for political rights for all men, seeking to change the system by changing the power structure, and often seeking to resist the Malthusian impetus behind the workhouse measures. Lamarckian thinking held an incredibly strong appeal to the new reformers in the Chartist movement and elsewhere. Let's think for a moment about why that might be the case. Remember the Lamarckian model with its notion of the inner striving within each organism to improve, to become more complex. And then think about what that might happen if we apply it to society. Striving can make improvements, change the organism, and change the world. But more than that, if an organism is improved, then those improvements will be passed down to subsequent generations. It was a creed that was almost designed to appeal to people that wanted to make progress in society because it pointed towards profound possibilities for change. Adrian Desmond's Politics of Evolution points to Lamarck's appeal to radical medical men. Now, for you, this might seem a very bizarre concept, but back in the 1820s and the 1830s, the medical profession was very divided. On the one hand, you had the elite who monopolised all the hospital positions in London and who also held the main positions of power and authority in the royal colleges that were the licensing bodies for medicine. To a man, this elite was Paleite, believing in a designing God and believing that their medical science was partly geared towards revealing God's plan. Now, those seeking to reform what they saw as old corruption, a corruption that was not dissimilar to that could be seen in the political system, they hitched their carriage to Lamarckian thinking because it provided a model which purged the world of the teleology of creationism and which progressively challenged older notions of design. By asserting themselves as Lamarckians, they were rejecting the old order, but they were also indicating that science could be progressive, that science could be reformist. The politics of evolution before Darwin were firmly about creation versus progress. But evolution was about to become respectable, or if not respectable, at least acceptable. As we have seen, the publication of Vestiges opened up a way of thinking about the universe that allowed for law-given progress within the framework of deep time. Now, obviously, the author, Robert Chambers, who published Vestiges anonymously, was concerned about his respectability. It was dodgy ground on which to be standing. Nevertheless, it was ground that had to some extent been broken by people like Charles Lyell, who had developed deep time through his uniformitarian model. Basically, geology had established the ancient age of the Earth. If you factor in as well a burgeoning popular printing industry aiming to appeal to the educated working classes and the lower middle classes, and also the underlying belief in progress that was at the heart of the Victorian dream, the idea of transmutation becomes less scary, even if it still challenged dominant modes of religious thinking and religious power. Indeed, Prince Albert, the progressive consort of Queen Victoria, clearly understood its appeal, and as a promoter of scientific progress, was willing to consider the hypothesis. However, within the upper echelons of science, those who had the most power, in particular the Paleite elite, anathematized it. For a respectable gentleman like Darwin, who not only was educated by these men, but knew them well, this might have created a problem. There is no doubt that the 1830s and the 1840s were incredibly turbulent times. We have to remember, for example, that in 1830 there were a series of revolutions that spread across Europe. Britain was not affected by revolution, but there were great concerns that it was going to occur there as it had in France. And then, again, in 1848, revolutions swept across Europe. In that year, over 1 million Chartists assembled at Kennington in South London, and there were great concerns that this again would tip over into revolution. We can see how Darwin might have treated his radical idea as something that could have drastically affected social stability. But all things pass, society started settling down. The economy grew and then became more stable. And during the 1850s, there was a period of prosperity and social stability that was unrivaled for the previous 50 or 60 years. The question we then have to ask is it any coincidence that Darwin came back to his theory with a vengeance at the point when society had seemingly become safer?